Think beyond traditional business banking. Think a partner that gives you in-depth financial insights.
Now, unless you've been living under a rock, you should know November 30 to December 12, the world gathers in the United Arab Emirates for COP28, the 28th Conference of Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. On the agenda, specific solutions that might be scaled up this decade to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, build resilience, and mobilize finance at scale. So who needs to do what? My panel has the answers. Let me introduce them. Peter Attard Motalto, Managing Director and Lead of Political Economy, Markets and Just Energy Transition at Krutham. We're also being joined by Shameela Soobramoney, the CEO of the National Business Institute. We were hoping for a third guest to be able to join us, but unfortunately, they were unable at the last minute to be able to do so. But I am very, very confident in my guests that we're going to be able to get through the key issues that COP28 is going to be looking at. So let me begin with you, Shameela, and ask from the National Business Institute perspective. You are a big umbrella. What are you guys looking forward to?
Thank you very much, Godfrey, for having us. We're certainly looking for a COP that is going to bring, firstly, a lot more awareness, considering that this is the COP where we're going to do a global stock take. And really what that is a stock take of where we are in relation to actual emissions reductions and how far on that pathway we've gone. It's anticipated that that is going to show that we're nowhere near where we need to be for progress. And hopefully what that does is going to spur action. Importantly, I think also drawing on your previous interview, getting the finance that's going to be required, but also landing the messages on what really is the correct matching of finances to the needs of a just transition in particular. And so how do we understand what is required for a country like ours and others, of course, in similar trajectories in funding those needs, and so that the type of offers of help that we're getting are aligned to our actual needs. We also would want to see stronger partnerships between business and government, and we'd like to see more action being demonstrated through the kinds of projects that we'll see showcased at the Pavilion. I think from the negotiation perspective, we would like to, as I've mentioned already, cover clarity on the financing. I think also a lot more on looking at loss and damage and building up adaptation financing. We know we're already experiencing many of what are going to be ongoing challenges in response to climate change. And so the need for adaptation is already there. Loss and damage already needs to be supported. We have to, as a matter of urgency, agree on what that is going to look like. And so we're hoping to see more of that. So aligned with that action and the financing, I think, is an acute awareness of the concerns around biodiversity and water in particular. There is going to be no just transition without us adequately considering these matters. I'll pause for now on that, Godfrey.
Yeah, thanks for that, Shameela. Peter, if I can come to you, and I wanted your view. Obviously, you watch the continent, you watch South Africa in particular, and I wanted to know from what you have heard and the view that you have on the agenda that's been put on the table, whether you see an alignment. But at the same time, I also just wanted your thoughts on COP28 and its perhaps relevance in this environment that we are in.
Thanks, Godfrey. Well, I think there's going to be two agendas. I mean, the official agenda is potentially going to be somewhat more controversial. There's obviously a lot of issues around the UAE hosting it. There are going to be a lot of oil and gas companies there that weren't there at the previous two COPs, as an example. But really, the tone of these things is set, somewhat outside the official negotiations. Always the pavilions that, like the NBI has for the various countries. And I think that's where we're really going to get this shift from thinking about avoiding 1.5 degree warming to the implications of 1.5 degrees warming. And as Shameela was saying, that's where the discussions, which have been not missing, but just sort of slightly down the pecking order in previous COPs, like adaptation financing, like resilience financing, are really going to come to the fore. I think we're going to see insurance companies and people like that thinking about innovative and scalable solutions, again, much more to the fore perhaps than previous COPs. So in some sense, it should be a little bit more realistic. I think some of the previous COPs were much more about hope, hope of avoiding 1.5 degrees, etc. And hopefully some burning platform comes appropriate metaphor comes out a little bit more, given the scale of shifts in weather and climate that we are seeing already.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about your view, Peter, just about perhaps the usefulness, or maybe I'm being unkind here, but the relevance of this conversation and whether you see it practically making changes that we need on the ground, i.e. The big volumes of documents that's going to be shared, and I'm holding one of them, and this is just the agenda pages alone that I have here, and the need for the action that's required on the ground. Do you see that happening?
Well, there's always some degree of disconnect, right? And there is the whole dressing up in process and protocol. But I think that's the point, that the COP ultimately, for all the madnesses that do go on in terms of the official protocol and the official negotiations and everything, creates this environment, right, where these important conversations can happen. That's what the MBI is there to do at COP, and does it very, very well. And so I think, yes, there are all these documents, and there are all these words written that not many people will read, but there are important connections and important conversations that will be had, particularly people like the African Climate Foundation, who will be there in force, pushing various different agendas. We've done a lot of work with them on scaling finance as well. The PCC will be there as well. I think it's a question, would we be taking the right steps without COP? Yes, but probably in a slightly more muddled and slightly less coordinated manner. And as much as we like to criticize deliverables, politicians loving deliverables, it does focus the mind. And we are going to see, the JET P implementation plan coming out timed around COP. Now that might have gone for months and months longer, and it is coming out now, because COP is there. So it plays a role. Certainly, we shouldn't be too dismissive of it.
Okay, that's an important point, because I know you are sometimes extremely tough on these talk shops. But Shameela, I wanted to know from your perspective as well, just how much hope you are hanging onto this gathering from a business perspective, and the kind of issues. Well, you have talked about some of the issues, and I'm going to come and dig a little deeper into them. But I just wanted to know from your expectations, what you see potentially coming through that could be useful here.
I completely agree with Peter. I mean, there are almost two pieces that you need to look at here: the official negotiations and what happens in the actual discussions. So the one thing I think from having myself attended 2 COPs, the last 2 previous COPs, is that so much of the conversation and really happens at the pavilions and those spaces outside the formal negotiation, where a lot of the knowledge sharing happens and where you really get to see what's going on. And for example, at the South African Pavilion, my observation has been it's the one place where in a year you see people you would never see together normally. And that enables conversations you wouldn't normally see happen either. So my expectation personally is that this is going to be done in a far more open way. We're going to be a lot more honest about the challenges we faced. But on the back of that, the action that we need to take at scale and rapidly. And so that is really my hope for what needs to happen, is that can we land actions, and can we land those actions at scale? I've also just come back from New York Climate Week, where in the opening session we had the COP high-level champions speaking as well. And I think what was really interesting was that, from the presidency side, they were talking about the need to be able to have multi-year agendas. And part of the challenge was this kind of annual COP, right? And what does that mean when you're changing presidencies every year for the continuation of the agenda? And so hopefully what we're going to see is a better traction around 2 or 3 deliverables that have a multi-year agenda that will be carried through in a far more meaningful way from an action and implementation perspective. Yeah. So I would like to see that. I would also certainly want to see that the adequate support that business needs in particular, and that would be around certainty on policy, on what is required, comes through a lot more clearly. So a lot of hope is hanging on the JET implementation, the plan for the JET IP, the investment plan and the implementation thereof that will address the 8.5 billion that we got at COP26, and hopefully the first of many other offers. So we want to see that coming through, because what that will do is increase the certainty around what it is we're going to be investing in, and therefore what business can now take action on to be able to achieve that scale at speed that we need if we have any hope of actually dealing with some of the challenge.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about your pavilion. But perhaps before I even do that, I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about what's going to happen at your pavilion, because you were suggesting that there will be a lot of stuff that will be discussed there that potentially has an impact at the bigger tables where the final decisions are going to be taken. How does it look like? Paint it for us if you can.
The pavilion. Well, pavilion firstly is a space within the what we call the blue zone at COP28, which is largely a controlled access area, but where all of the countries showcase their pavilions, and it really is a space where you can host events, have little meetings and things like that. South African Pavilion traditionally has hosted a number of events for the full duration of COP. We're probably looking at 5 or 6 a day, and those often are led by the sponsors and of course with the different entities from government as well. Remember, we co-host that pavilion with the DFFE, and so that agenda would really look at what is the South African agenda alongside the international agenda. Because it is largely a showcase space for companies, we're expecting to see a lot of what they're doing, but also the initiation of conversations that bring about a lot of awareness. So we will have the likes of the PCC there, the DFFE obviously would be there, Africa Climate Foundation and the like. And so we'll see a number of our companies as well coming in from financial services, from the real economy, and have that space to showcase, but also have discussions. It often also is a great informal meeting space for many people, like I said, that you would not normally see in terms of CEOs, ministers, and the like at the pavilion. So the space is a place, firstly, that's a home for South Africa and for our delegation, and really brings a feeling of unity, which is something I think we desperately need given some of our challenges. And it is a space where those events often are well attended also by other people from other countries. So it's where you really get to get different country perspectives, different sector perspectives, and different entity body perspectives, be it government, NGO, business, civil society coming together. So we expect to see a lot of that. And then the cross-pollination that comes from having a place where people can come to. Again, having looked at previously, I've had the instance of sitting at the pavilion listening to an event next to somebody who was a professor at the London School of Economics, who said to me, I come to South African Pavilion because I always learn, and this is where the action really is taking place, and the fantastic efforts that are being made are being showcased. So it's an opportunity to showcase what we are doing right, where often we feel like, hope is a little bit difficult to come by, but also an opportunity in that space to go and learn what else is happening at other places in the world and in a confined area, which gives you this really amazing opportunity to understand, to see, and to hear nuances that, are very difficult to do in your normal day job.
Absolutely. I'm reminded a little bit of Davos, where you go and perhaps you may not even sit in a particular session, but the opportunity to mix and mingle with other people from different facets of society presents itself. Peter, so Shameela spoke about the just energy transition, which you referenced as well. And we know there's that $8.5 billion that is on the table. And we also know that we've heard that it's not enough. And there have also been complaints that the bulk of that money is actually a credit, which we do not need, or loans, which are going to burden future generations. But I wanted to broaden the question and ask a little bit, are we expecting any new commitments here?
I mean, there are a few extra commitments from countries coming in. We have to be very careful about these. So Netherlands and Denmark are joining the IPG. Spain is sort of floating on the outside, as is Ireland as well. But I think we have to be very, very careful. I mean, the numbers do not entirely add up. I mean, there's a lot of commercial stuff in there that would have happened anyway. There's a lot of potential, for instance, grid financing that actually doesn't need to be financed by IFIs and can be, or other countries, and can be financed by the private sector and by private savings pools in South Africa. There has been a success in the last year of upping the grant amount. I think it's increased from 80 odd to 300 odd now million dollars, but it's still a small part overall. But I think the money is always the distraction here. I mean, as I said, we can't really make it fully add up to the 8.5 that you get. The UK is providing a guarantee for the AFDB, and you double count that, and there's all these other questions. But what has happened around this is this focused conversation, about what has to happen and processes that are being put in place. The JETP project management unit and the presidency is busy, asking a lot of awkward questions and moving the dial. I think that's the more interesting part of JETP, actually, more than the money itself. The money, if we think about it, will even if you were to get it and use it all, would last for a couple of years, 5 years in the JET implementation plan. And ultimately, we're talking about forming a 30-year transition path with scalable private sector financing in the long term. So it's about these institutions and these sort of underlying conversations and structural change, which I think are the value in it.
Yeah, and I actually wanted to follow up on that point about the involvement of the private sector and the creation of the environment for the private sector to be able to come in. I can't remember whether it was the World Bank or the IMF, but one of those two institutions was suggesting that the bulk of the money for these transitions ought to be coming from the private sector. Do you see that happening, number one? And secondly, are we seeing enough in the policy space that would enable the private sector to come in?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think we've been writing a lot with the African Climate Foundation about unlocking scalable financing. There's a lot of detailed changes, capital market reforms that have to happen, various other sort of blended finance structures that are needed in some very hard parts of the transition, like socioeconomic change that has to happen. But no, in the broad, big bulk things like transmission and generation, we've seen in the REAP program, you can get huge amounts of private onshore and offshore capital coming to bear. We think the vast majority of the transmission build, the 14.5 billion rand needed per year of transmission, almost all of that can come from the private sector. If you can, again, do some of these changes, we need to have a well-formed, bankable national transmission company of South Africa. That process is ongoing. So there's a lot of dependencies here, certainly, to access and scale the private financing. But I think it's absolutely possible. And, other countries show these are often, really transmission assets, for instance, are really dull, bankable, reliable financial instruments that people invest in.
Sure. Shameela, you want to come in on that money aspect and the division of labor, if you like, between what government can provide in terms of fresh capital, as well as obviously the policy initiatives that would enable the private sector to bring in its own money?
Completely. So just to build a little bit on what Peter's saying, I think that covers what is normally would be financed anyway. So there's definitely an opportunity to delineate what would be financed anyway, because private sector is going to come in if something is bankable, right? They will invest anyway. So it is really, I think for me, maybe the focus to look at what is not traditionally bankable and what needs additional support is where we would need to pay attention and find those mechanisms like the blended finance mechanisms to be able to support those investments. But what it does presuppose is that we have clarity on the plan. We understand what exactly it is we need to finance in the transition. We've seen that spectrum. We've differentiated what is bankable traditionally versus what isn't, and therefore is then more suitable for blended finance models, and where you can bring in some of that concessional finance or the grant funding, to take first losses and the like. And then, of course, what is just not something that is suitable for debt, for example, that is completely grant, and usually that will fall in the spectrum of the more social issues. So if we think about the just transition, for example, and we're thinking about Mpumalanga and a number of people who are going to lose their jobs, there are some who you might be able to replace jobs for, perhaps green jobs into the green economy, maybe into other sectors as we develop different sectors around there. But there might be those who may be close to retirement, for example, or for other reasons, you're just not going to be able to replace those jobs. And so you're going to have to give them, kind of payouts, pension plans, compensation, and that's not really the type of thing you should be raising debt for example. So actually for us, clearly defining what those needs are and then going with the right asks to match those financing is going to be critical for us to be able to use that to fund that transition in the right way, and crowd in where we need to the private sector funding to be able to tap into those deep and liquid pools that we know we have in the country. And then the certainty around that, and of course the governance on the implementation of that money coming in, is really going to be the pivotal factors for us.
I've got to ask you though, you sit where you sit, you bring in business, and as you were saying, you get the opportunity to be able to mix and mingle with all sorts of people from different backgrounds, but also crucially, of course, from the government side. And we have seen what collaboration between the government and the private sector can do in South Africa now. I mean, I think of the Zuma years, and I think of all the squabbling and quarreling, and then I look at what is happening now, and I'm seeing a sea change. Are you more hopeful where you are that you'll be able to build the kind of partnerships and trust, importantly, that will enable the discussion of the key things that ought to change for the money that you're talking about to be unlocked?
So I think a case in point, it's always better to have some kind of evidence to back up when you have that view. It's certainly the work that's been done currently between business and government under the Business for South Africa banner, which a number of the business associations are involved in, that has been focusing on the three streams being energy, logistics, and the crime and corruption. So those three pillars that we've got very focused business support and input, agreeing with government, sitting with the president every few weeks and saying these are the critical areas that we need to tackle, and there's report backs on progress, including the support that's been given by business through the National Energy Crisis Committee, the Resource Mobilization Fund, and the like, and the National Logistics Crisis Committee. And those are very, very closely involved with government. And the intention, of course, there is to just say, can we just try stop the slide? And if we can do that, then we might be able to lock in 3%. 3%, of course, is nowhere near good enough to be able to achieve what we need to achieve from a jobs perspective, for example. But at least if we can stop that and we can continue at that level of trust and that level of progress with government, then we are likely to be able to see progress. What that will do is embed the trust. What that will do is start embedding the mechanisms and the way of working between government and business that hopefully will yield those results that will set the foundation ongoing for anything, any kind of investment we get, including climate investment into the country. So I see that that is a good starting point. And then, of course, it's going to be the governance around that. And there is the elephant in the room, which is the looming national election, and to be able to see what happens post that, and the result, the opportunity to continue that that engagement that business has been having, I think, quite successfully with government starting in February this year via that project in particular.
Absolutely. I can assure you we'll have a team on the ground, and we're going to try and see if we can find space within your space and listen to some of those conversations that you said are going to be taking place there. Peter, before we go, I wanted to refer a little bit to what you spoke about at the beginning. Of course, she spoke about the elephant in the room, referring to South Africa, but there's an elephant in the world as well in the form of big oil and COP28. And this conversation has been had, but I just wanted to know from your perspective whether we should, given that difference between big oil, and we saw a big pushback this week, and the goals of COP28, whether we will be able to walk away with tangible goals here that advance all the issues we've been talking about.
Well, I mean, I think those conversations, the role of NGOs, the role of business and others at COP28 is going to mean that there are plenty of positive step forwards taken, even if the official talk shop, becomes maybe somewhat contentious or even derailed. But no, I mean, I think there's a sensible discussion to be had on oil and gas, on its role in the transition. Actually, the Total EIA approval from DFFE this week is an interesting case in point. Should South Africa, if it doesn't, they want to burn that much gas to power, be able to export it, for instance? There hasn't really been a conversation on that kind of thing in South Africa. And so I think it is a useful staging point to locate oil and gas in the transition. I think the answer is not, that you should turn all the taps off tomorrow. The vast majority of people still have, petrol and diesel cars, and we are on a transition. We are on this 30-year pathway. We need some urgency, given we are missing the 1.5 degree target. And I think that conversation will be very loud and will be had certainly on the sidelines, regardless of what happens in the official agenda.
Peter, thank you very much indeed. It's a long conversation. It's a big conversation. It's beginning. There will be lots of backstabbing and politics going on. But we're certainly hoping that we'll be able to bring some of those conversations here on CNBC Africa. Thank you very much indeed. I love your back view, by the way, of Johannesburg. Thank you. But from all of us here, there we go. Thank you very much indeed. You've been watching The Power Table.
Think beyond traditional business banking. Think a partner that gives you in-depth financial insights.